The wind never stopped. It was the first citizen of San Amaro, here before the first adobe brick was laid, and it would be here after the last one crumbled. It blew across the high semi-arid plateau of the New Mexico Territory in the year 1878, carrying red dust that tasted of alkali and distance. The dust settled on everything. It coated the stunted pinon pines, settled in the wrinkles of men's faces, and filmed the surface of the water in the bucket. Water was the second citizen, and a tyrant. All of San Amaro's life was tethered to the single deep well in the center of the dusty plaza. The well was a stone mouth that spoke only of scarcity. Around it, the town existed a single street of low, flat-roofed buildings baked the color of the earth. There was the Paloma Saloon, its doors always swinging, a livery stable smelling of hay and manure, a mercantile with a faded sign, and a small adobe church whose bell tower had no bell. And then there was Eliza Hart's school. Right now, it was 4 pine stakes driven into a patch of stubborn, rocky ground 50 yards from the church. The stakes marked a rectangle of ambition. They were the only green wood in sight, brought from mountains a hard day's ride away. Eliza Hart herself, age 24 and newly arrived from Missouri, stood looking at those stakes. The wind pulled at the pins in her hair, loosening strands of brown hair to whip across her face. She tasted the red dust. She wore a dress of dark wool, too heavy for this climate, and her boots were city boots, thin-soled and foolish. In her valise, she carried a rolled architect's drawing, a blueprint for a public schoolhouse. It showed windows, a real floor, and a bell tower. In her trunk, sitting at the small room she rented behind the mercantile, were books, Shakespeare, primers, histories, geography. She had come to build a school, not just any school, but a school for everyone. That was the phrase she had used in her letters to the territorial authorities, the phrase that had echoed in her own heart. The children of the shopkeepers, the children of the ranchers, even the scattered, shy children of the Chiricahua who sometimes appeared at the edge of town like ghosts, drawn by curiosity. They would all learn to read. They would all learn that the world was wider than this dusty plaza. A few townsfolk watched her. They did it from behind curtains, from the shaded doorways of the saloon. This woman from the east, with her pale skin and her drawings, she was another fool the desert would soon break. From the far side of the plaza, near the livery, a man watched her too. He did not hide his watching. He sat astride a lean dun horse, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. This was Mateo Crow. He was 30 years old, the owner of the Crow Mesa Ranch, a man built of rawhide and silence. His heritage was Tejano and English, a mix that gave him dark eyes and a guarded mouth. He had been an Army scout once, years ago. What he had seen, and what he had done, had put a quietness in him that the town mistook for coldness. They called him the man with a heart of iron, remembering a raid years past, a story told in whispers, a story that had left him the sole owner of his land and water. He watched Eliza Hart look at her 4 sticks. He saw the blueprint in her hand, flapping like a broken wing. He saw her chin lift against the wind. Mateo knew this land. He knew that ambition was a dangerous thing. It was like planting a crop in a dry year. It invited only heartbreak. His own goals were simpler, more brutal. Hold his land, protect his herd, keep his water, the spring on his land. The Ojo Verde was his lifeblood. He knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that others wanted it. A wagon rumbled past, heading for the well. Marshal Cobb was organizing the water ration. He was a large man, his belly pushing against a tarnished star. Cobb worked for the town, but his loyalty, everyone knew, belonged to Silas Vane. Vane's name was on the new mining office, though he was rarely seen. Vane was a man of the railroad, of capital, of the future. And his future required land, minerals, and all the water. Cobb was Vane's man, a lazy hammer waiting to fall. Mateo's gaze shifted from Eliza to the hills beyond the town. He saw movement where no one else would. A flicker of dun against dun. A heat shimmer that had a human shape. He nodded to himself, his expression unchanged. Taza Naiche watched them all. He lay flat on a sandstone ridge a mile away, the rock still warm from the midday sun. He was a young man, perhaps the same age as the teacher, but his eyes were ancient. He was Chiricahua, a warrior tasked with protecting his people. Not from the army, not this week, but from the scalp hunters paid by the territory and the land thieves who saw his ancestral home as empty dirt. He watched the town well, the center of their weak, thirsty lives. He watched the new woman, the one who stared at empty ground. He watched the rancher, Mateo Crow, the man who had a heart of iron and who, unlike the others, knew how to look at the hills. Taza's English was sparse, learned from traders and soldiers, but it was precise. He knew the words foralier and thief and treaty. He knew the words cool. He wondered what that word meant to this new woman. Was it another way to steal? His goal was the land itself, the trails his people had walked for 1,000 years, the springs where they prayed, the ground that held the bones of his ancestors. He was not a ghost. He was the owner, watching trespassers argue over his inheritance. Eliza Hart finally turned away from her patch of dirt. She clutched the blueprint to her chest, a fragile shield against the vast, uncaring sky. She walked back toward the mercantile, her posture straight, her spirit bruised but not broken. She passed the well, where Marshal Cobb was telling a Mexican woman her family had already had its share for the day. As she passed, she overheard two men talking outside the saloon. Their voices were low, but the wind carried the words, "Vane's surveyors are back. They're running a line straight for Crow's Spring. He won't sell. Vane does not buy what he can take." Eliza paused. She did not understand the names, not yet, but she understood the tone. It was the sound of iron scraping on stone. It was the sound of a world that had no room for her 4 pine stakes. She stopped at the well. The water was low, the bucket coming up only half full. The man holding the rope was one of Vane's hired guns, a man with a pistol worn low and hands that looked too clean. He controlled the rope. He controlled the bucket. He controlled who drank. Eliza looked from the well to the man, and then back to her empty plot of land. She said the words to herself, a phrase from a book her father loved, a phrase that was now her only prayer. Freedom and knowledge must stand together. If not, the dust swallows both. She did not know that the rancher with the heart of iron had heard that prayer in the set of her shoulders. She did not know that the warrior on the hill was watching the man at the well, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. In San Amaro, the stage was set. It was a town of red dust and sage, of a saloon and a church, and now a school that was nothing but wind blowing over 4 sticks of wood. The stagecoach ride from Santa Fe had been a trial of endurance, but the final 10 miles, the stretch that led into the high country and down into San Amaro, was the worst. Eliza Hart was the only passenger. She sat clutching her valise, her bones vibrating with the wagon's relentless, jarring rhythm. The air was thinner here, the sun a physical weight. They were in Coyote Notch, a narrow pass between rust-colored sandstone cliffs that rose like broken teeth on either side. The driver, a man named Henderson with a face like cured leather, had been silent for the last hour. "Almost through," he grunted, his voice rough. "Be in San Amaro inside of 30 minutes. Can smell the dust from here." Eliza was about to reply, to offer some word of thanks, when the sound came. It was not a bang, but a sharp, flat crack that echoed instantly, seeming to come from all sides at once. It was followed by the whine of a hornet passing her ear and the splintering of wood just behind her head. "Down!" Henderson yelled, his voice cracking. He was already pulling on the reins, the 6-horse team screaming in panic. Another shot, this one was lower. Henderson cried out, a sharp, breathless sound, and slumped forward. The reins went slack. The wagon, now uncontrolled, lurched violently. Eliza grabbed the driver, Mr. Henderson. He was slumped over, but his eyes were open, wide with terror. Blood was seeping through his shirt, a dark stain on his shoulder. My arm. He just grazed me. He tried to grab the reins again, but his arm would not obey. From the rocks above, a man's voice called out. That is far enough, wagon man. And you, Missy, throw down the strong box. Eliza peered out. She could see him, balanced on a ledge about 60 feet up. A man in a dusty duster, his face hidden by a bandana. He was already levering another shell into his rifle. We do not have a strong box, Eliza shouted, her voice thin in the dry air. I am a teacher. I have books. Lying is a sin. Missy, the man called down, his laugh a dry rattle. He raised the rifle, aiming not at her, but at the lead horse. A crippled team here would be a death sentence. Now, the box, or the horses. Eliza's heart was a hammer in her chest. This was it. This was the end of her dream, to die in a dusty pass over a box she did not possess. Henderson was fumbling at his boot, trying to pull a pistol, his face white with pain. Cannot let him. Before the man on the ledge could fire, another sound joined the echoes. A sound so quiet it was almost lost. A soft thwack, like a hawk striking, but sharper. The man on the ledge yelled, a sound of pure surprise. His rifle, which had been steady, flew from his hands. It spun in the air, the wooden stock clearly shattered near the trigger guard, and clattered onto the rocks below. The man stared at his stinging hands, then looked wildly around. Not down, but up at the higher ridges. Eliza followed his gaze. She saw nothing but stone and shadow. A second thwack came. This one kicked up dust at the man's feet, a puff of red dirt that made him scramble backward. Crab walking in panic. Who is that? Henderson whispered, trying to push himself up. I do not know, Eliza said. Then, a new sound. Hoofbeats. Not the frantic scramble of the wagon team, but the steady, fast rhythm of riders. Coming from the direction of San Amaro. 3 men on horseback rounded the bend. The man in the lead was Mateo Crow. He rode his dun horse as if he were part of it, his face calm, unreadable. His rifle was already out, resting across his saddle. The 2 men with him, cowboys from his ranch, fanned out, their own weapons ready. Mateo did not even look at the wagon. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the cliffs. He saw the man with the broken rifle, now trying to crawl into a crevice. Milo, Mateo said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. You and Jake, get the horses. To the second man, go see about that one. The cowboy named Jake spurred his horse and began climbing the loose scree toward the ambusher. Mateo himself dismounted. He walked to the wagon, his movements economical. No wasted energy. He looked at Henderson, at the blood. He is hit, Eliza said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. Grazed, Henderson muttered, clutching his arm. Mateo looked at Eliza. His gaze was not gentle. It was assessing, like a man judging livestock, or the sky for rain. It lingered for a moment, and she felt the chill of it. He had seen her in town, staring at her patch of dirt. He had judged her as a fool then. He was judging her as a liability now. He stepped up onto the wagon's runner and, with one arm, hauled Henderson from the driver's box. You will ride with Milo. I will drive the wagon in. Who was that? Eliza asked, pointing up at the rocks. The one who helped? Mateo was already gathering the reins, his hands sure and strong. His gaze flicked up to the high ridge. Just a shadow. But Eliza saw him, just for a second, standing on a higher ledge of sandstone, a figure outlined against the hard blue sky. He was still, watching them. He was not one of the ranchers. His hair was long, bound by a cloth. He held a rifle, not a bow. Then he turned, and as if the rock itself had absorbed him, he was gone. "Get in the back, ma'am," Mateo said. It was not a request. "Keep your head down until we are clear of the notch." Jake, the cowboy, came scrambling back down, holding something. "Found this on him. Boss, he's just some drunk from the mining camp." He held up a small, dull metal tag. Mateo took it, turning it over in his gloved hand. Eliza saw the letters stamped into it. Faint and small, vain security. Mateo's expression did not change. He did not say the name aloud. He simply closed his fist around the tag and slipped it into his pocket. He climbed into the driver's seat. The wagon lurched forward, and they were moving again. Faster now, toward San Amaro. When they arrived at the plaza, a crowd gathered instantly. The sight of Henderson being helped down, his shirt bloody, and Mateo Crow at the reins was enough to stop all work. "What happened?" the blacksmith called out. "Ambush, Coyote Notch," Mateo said. His voice flat, he was already unhitching the team. Marshal Cobb pushed his way through the crowd, his face flushed. "Ambush? Was it Apaches?" Before Mateo could answer, Eliza Hart climbed down from the wagon, her wool dress covered in red dust. Her hair was half down, but her eyes were burning. "It was a white man," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "He was on the rocks. He shot Mr. Henderson." Cobb looked annoyed. "A lone highwayman? Then, you are lucky to be alive. Miss," he made no move to get a description, to take a report. "He dropped this, Marshal," Jake said, holding up the broken rifle stock, "and my friend found his tag." Cobb's eyes narrowed. "Tag what tag?" Mateo Crow spoke, his back still to the crowd as he worked on a harness. "Nothing. Marshal, just some drunk. He will have a headache in the morning." He tossed the harness aside and turned. His eyes met Cobb's. A silent, hard exchange. Cobb looked away first. "Well," Cobb said, puffing himself up, "my advice, miss, is to stay in town. The hills are dangerous, full of skulking Indians and deserters. No place for a lady." Just then, Taza Naichi rode into the plaza. He rode bareback on a paint pony, his rifle resting across his thighs. He had come for the well, to fill a single water skin. He ignored the crowd, as he always did, his face a mask of serene indifference. "See," Cobb said, lowering his voice but making sure everyone heard, "it is not safe." The crowd shifted. Whispers broke out. The fear of the Apache was old and deep, and Cobb had just given it a name and a face. Men put their hands on their holsters. Women pulled their children closer. Taza stopped his pony at the well. He must have felt the eyes on him, the sudden spike of tension. He did not look at them. He dismounted, his movements as fluid as water, and walked to the bucket. Eliza Hart had watched him on the ridge. She had seen him save her, and the driver. And now she saw this. She saw the crowd's suspicion, and Cobb's smug satisfaction. She walked forward, past Cobb, past the whispering townsfolk, until she stood in the center of the plaza, halfway between the wagon and the well. She was standing on the patch of dirt she had claimed for her school. "There will be a school," she announced. Her voice trembled, but she did not back down. The entire town went silent. Even Taza paused, his hand on the well rope. "This is a town of good people," Eliza continued, finding her strength, "and our children deserve to learn. Class will begin 1 week from today. That is Monday next." Where the blacksmith called out, "You have no building, miss." "We will have one," she said, "and if we do not, then I will teach under the cottonwood tree by the church. But the school will open." She looked at the faces. Skepticism, fear, a very few, looked hopeful. "That is not all," she said, taking a breath. "Mr. Henderson was shot, but we were saved. We were saved by a man on the ridge, a man who shot the rifle from the ambusher's hands, and who did not stay for thanks. She turned and looked directly at Taza Naiche. He was watching her now, his dark eyes unreadable. "I believe that man is here, and I thank him." A collective gasp went through the crowd. To thank a Chiricahua, one who was being blamed for the very danger she had faced. It was madness. Cobb stepped forward. "Now, miss, you do not know what you are saying. That is—" "Mesa Crow," Mateo's voice cut through the tension. He had finished with the horses and was standing by the wagon. Everyone turned to him. "My old line shack, north edge of my property. It has a roof and a good door." Eliza stared at him. The man with the heart of iron. "It is empty," he continued, his gaze still wary, as if he regretted the words already. "You can use it, temporarily. It is quiet there." "The Crow Ranch," someone whispered. "That is 2 miles out." "It is safe," Mateo said, and the way he said it was a flat statement of fact. Eliza looked at him, gratitude warring with the chill she still felt from his stare. "Thank you, Mr. Crow. I accept." Taza Naiche had finished filling his water skin. He walked to his pony. He looked at Eliza Hart, and for the first time he spoke to her. His English was slow, measured. "He is right," Taza said, nodding toward Cobb. "The hills are not safe." He paused, then looked at the children hiding behind their mothers' skirts. "You teach? All?" "Yes," Eliza said, without hesitation. "All who wish to learn. My people's children, they can come." This was the line. Eliza knew it. She could feel the entire town holding its breath. To say yes was to cross a border from which there was no return. It was to invite the very trouble Cobb had warned against. She thought of Silas Vane, of the security tag in Mateo's pocket. She thought of the whispers about Vane needing cheap labor, ignorant labor. "The door is open to all," Eliza said, her voice ringing in the silence. Taza Naiche nodded once, a deep, slow acknowledgement. "Then I will watch the path. From the notch to the shack, the children will be safe." He swung himself onto his pony. Before he rode out, he looked at Mateo. It was not a look of friendship. It was a look of shared space, of two predators acknowledging a new and unpredictable element in their territory. Taza kicked his pony, and he was gone, a silent shadow heading back to the rocks. The crowd broke apart, muttering. Cobb spat in the dust, his face dark. He knew he had lost this round. Eliza Hart was left alone in the plaza. Mateo Crow had already started walking toward the saloon, his long strides eating up the ground. He had made his offer, and he was done. Eliza looked down at the 4 pine stakes that marked her dream. They seemed so small now. She reached into the valise she still carried, her knuckles white. She pulled out the one thing she had of value that was not a book, a fine, new quill pen, with a nib she had carefully trimmed that morning. She walked to the center of her imaginary schoolhouse, and with all the strength she had left, she jammed the pen deep into the hard, unforgiving earth. It stood upright, a thin, feathered spear, a marker. "The school is here," she whispered to the wind. Silas Vane's influence arrived before he did. It came on a freight wagon, piled high with new pine benches, 20 of them, smooth and smelling of resin and the sawmill. They were stacked in front of the small adobe church, a gift to the God-fearing folk of San Amaro. Marshal Cobb called the town meeting for that evening. He did not call it in the church. He called it in the Paloma Saloon, a fact that told Eliza Hart everything she needed to know. The saloon was a box of noise and yellow light. It was thick with the smoke of cheap cigars and the sharp smell of whiskey. Men who seldom came to town, small ranchers and prospectors, stood 3 deep along the bar, drinking Vane's free liquor. Cobb stood on a crate, his belly straining his vest. "Gentlemen," he boomed, his eyes sweeping the room. He deliberately ignored Eliza, who stood just inside the swinging doors, her back to the wall. "Mr. Silas Vane sends his compliments. He is a man who believes in progress, and he sends these benches as a sign of his good faith in this community. A few men clapped, a ragged, uncertain sound. "He believes so much," Cobb continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble, "that he is prepared to petition the railroad, to bring the main line right through San Amaro. Not a spur line. Gentlemen, the main line." The air in the room changed. Men stopped drinking. They leaned forward. This was not about church benches. This was about money. It was about survival. "Imagine it," Cobb said, spreading his hands. "Jobs. Freight rates cut in half. Real prosperity. A future for your children." "What is the catch?" Marshall, a man called from the back. "No catch," Cobb smiled, but his eyes were hard. "Just progress. The railroad requires stability. It requires unity. Mr. Vane cannot invest in a territory that is fractured. He needs the land titles unified. He needs to know who owns what. He needs us to be one community, growing together, under one law." The threat hung in the smoke. Unified meant Vane owning it. Fractured meant any small rancher who held out. It meant Mateo Crow and his spring. It meant the Chiricahua lands that Vane considered empty. Then Cobb's gaze, heavy and unpleasant, finally landed on Eliza. "Which brings me to this." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "This is an official order from the Territorial Authority, due to the recent ambush and the rising tensions. I am hereby forbidding any and all unlawful assemblies." He unfolded the paper and pinned it to the rough wooden wall with a tack. "Any gathering that threatens the public peace or mixes populations in a way that incites trouble is forbidden. This order is effective immediately. This includes gatherings in unauthorized structures, or," he added, his eyes locking with Eliza's, "under trees." The room was silent. Eliza felt the eyes of every man on her. She felt the weight of their fear and their sudden, fragile hope for the railroad. She stepped forward, away from the wall. The smoke swirled around her. "Marshall Cobb," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the noise of the saloon. "I believe you are mistaken on the law." Cobb turned, a look of disbelief on his face. "Mistaken? Miss, I am the law in San Amaro." "You are the enforcer of the law," Eliza corrected him. Her voice was polite, but it had a spine of northern iron. "But the law itself comes from the territorial charter, which I have right here." She produced her own folded paper from her reticule. It was worn at the creases. "It guarantees the right of free assembly, Marshall, and it specifically provides for the establishment of public schools for all residents of the territory." A man at the bar gave a short, harsh laugh. "This is not Santa Fe, Missy. That paper does not mean much out here." "We are in the New Mexico territory," Eliza insisted, her gaze not leaving Cobb. "And this charter applies. My school is not an unlawful assembly. It is a legal and necessary one. The line shack Mr. Crow offered is private property, and I have his permission." Cobb's face was turning a deep, blotchy red. He took a step toward her. "I say what is lawful here, and I say you are done. Now get out of my saloon." The swinging doors opened again, letting in a shaft of cool night air. Mateo Crow stepped inside. He did not look at Cobb. He did not look at Eliza. He moved with that economy of motion she remembered, walking to the center table where 4 men were playing poker. He was carrying his carbine, held loosely in one hand, muzzle down. The players looked up, startled. "Deal me out, boys," Mateo said, his voice quiet. They scrambled to make room, scraping their chairs back. Mateo sat down at the table. He was sideways to Cobb, facing the bar. He placed the carbine on the table. He did not point it at anyone. He just laid it down. The sound of the heavy wood and oiled steel meeting the tabletop was not loud, but it was final. It was heavier than any shout. He looked up, first at Eliza, then at Cobb. "The lady," he said, his voice soft, was speaking. Cobb froze, His hand had been moving toward his pistol. He looked at the carbine. He looked at Mateo, whose face was calm, his eyes holding no expression at all. The tension in the room was a wire pulled tight. It was broken by a small man named Jedediah, a rancher with a small, thirsty plot of land that bordered Vane's new mining claim. He was twisting his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," Jedediah said, his voice cracking. "Miss Hart, we all want the school. I swear we do. My boy, he needs his letters, but—" Marshal Cobb is right about the tension. This mixing. He swallowed, his eyes darting toward the rifle on the table. "Maybe, just for now, maybe you could teach the town children in the shack and the others, the Chiricahua children, maybe they could learn somewhere else separate." It was a plea. It was the desperate compromise of a man caught between his fear of Vane and his hope for his son. Eliza looked at him, and her heart ached for him. She saw the compromise for what it was, the first step in a surrender. She had come here for this moment. She just had not known it would look like this. "No, Mr. Jedediah," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I cannot. The lesson is not just the alphabet. The lesson is all. If I teach some, then the lesson is a lie. It will be all children, or it will be no school at all." Jedediah looked at the floor. He had his answer. The saloon was silent. Mateo Crow watched Eliza, his expression unreadable, and he did not pick up his rifle. That night they met. Mateo had sent word through his man, Milo. "Boulder Ridge, midnight, come alone." Eliza had ridden a horse borrowed from the livery, her heart a drum against her ribs. The ridge was a black shape against a sky so full of stars it looked torn. She found them by a fire that was no more than a handful of red embers glowing in a circle of stone. Taza Naiche was already there, a shadow against a larger shadow. Mateo sat on his heels, feeding the fire one dry stick at a time. It gave off light, but almost no smoke. They sat in silence for a long time. The wind was the only sound, moving through the piñon. "He will not stop," Eliza said finally, the words sounding small in the vastness. "Cobb, Vane." "No," Mateo said. He was watching the embers. "He wants the water. My water. Ojo Verde." "Our water," Taza said. His voice was soft, but it cut through the night. Eliza looked at him. "What do you mean? Our?" Taza looked at Mateo, a long, appraising look. He seemed to come to a decision. He reached into a parfleche bag at his side and pulled out a roll of cured buckskin. He spread it carefully on the flat rock between them. It was a map. It was not a surveyor's map of squares and numbers. It was a map of memory, drawn in charcoal, with lines of red and yellow ochre. It showed the mountains, the valleys, the arroyos, and it showed the springs, each one a small blue circle. Taza placed one long finger on a blue circle. Ojo Verde, the green eye. "My father's father," Taza said, his English slow and precise, "made this. It was shown to the soldiers, the men from Washington, long ago." "A treaty," Eliza whispered, her mind racing. The legal implications flooded her thoughts. "They made paper," Taza said, his disregard for paper clear. "This is the truth. The paper is the shadow of this truth." He looked at Eliza. "The paper says Ojo Verde is for the people, for use, to drink, to pray, not for one man, not for a railroad." Mateo leaned in, his eyes tracing the lines. He knew this land as well as Taza, but he was seeing it through new eyes. If this treaty is on file in Santa Fe, if it is a legal, binding document, it is the key. Eliza finished, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce hope. Vane cannot unify land that is not his to take. He cannot seize land that is protected by a federal treaty. Mateo looked at Taza. Why show me this, my family? We have been on this land. We use that spring. You take water, Taza said simply. You do not break the spring. And he jerked his chin in the direction of the town. He will break it, kill it, for the black rocks. Ko, Mateo said, the word a curse. A bond was formed on that ridge. It was not friendship. It was a fragile alliance forged by a common enemy. Mateo spoke, his voice low, his eyes on the fire. I was a scout. I saw what the army did, what men like Vane did. They broke the land. They broke the people. I thought, if I stayed quiet on my own land, they would pass me by. I thought I could keep my hands clean. He looked at his hands, gloved and hard. They call me the Iron Heart. It is not iron, it is just rust. Eliza felt a sudden, sharp empathy for this guarded man. You are not rusted, Mr. Crow. You are just tired. He looked at her, and, for the first time, she did not see a cold rancher. She saw a man who had seen too much and felt too much. The plan was simple. Eliza would write to the territorial governor, referencing the treaty. Mateo would ride to Santa Fe himself. Taza would watch. But Vane or his men moved faster. The smell of smoke woke Eliza before dawn. It was not the familiar, sweet pinon smoke from the town's chimneys. It was harsh, chemical, and acrid. She threw on her dress and ran, her thin boots slipping on the rocks. She did not need to ask where. She ran the 2 miles toward Crow Mesa, toward the line shack, her lungs burning. She was not the first one there. Mateo was already there, on his dun horse. Just watching, the shack was gone. It was not just burned. It was a blackened, smoldering ruin. The roof had collapsed, sending a column of foul smoke into the pale dawn sky. Eliza walked toward it, her feet sinking into the hot ash. My books, she whispered. Her primers, the slates she had paid for herself, the benches she and Mateo's men had worked so hard to move, all gone. She felt a despair so total it buckled her knees. She sank to the ground, the heat scorching through her dress. They had won. Vane had won. Mateo dismounted. He walked into the smoking perimeter, ignoring the heat that shimmered around his legs. His face was a mask of cold fury. He kicked at a still-burning timber. They were thorough, he said, his voice a low growl. He saw something near what was left of the doorway. He knelt, pulling his glove on tighter, and reached into the embers. He pulled out a small, smoking piece of cardboard. He brought it to her. It was a matchbook. Most of it was burned away, but a corner remained. On it was a stark, black logo she had seen on the freight wagon that brought the benches. A letter V made from a railroad spike. Eliza stared at it. The proof, the arrogance of it. The despair vanished. It was burned away, replaced by a cold, sharp rage she had never known she possessed. She looked at the ruin. She knelt and picked up a piece of a charred adobe brick. It was still hot, and it was heavy in her hand. If they burn it, she said, her voice quiet and shaking with anger, we will build it higher. Mateo looked from the matchbook in his hand to the brick in hers. He saw the fire in her eyes, and it matched the one burning in his own gut. He had been silent for too long. And I will set the lock, Mateo said. Iron. Eliza stood up, brushing the ash from her skirt. They did this to stop me. They think I will run. Will you? He asked. It was a real question. No, she said. I'm moving the class. Where there is nowhere else? To the cottonwood tree, she said, looking back toward town. The big one, by the church, right in the open, right where Marshal Cobb pinned his notice. Mateo was silent for a moment. He understood the gamble. It was dangerous. It was brilliant. He will arrest you. Let him, Eliza said, clutching the burnt brick. Let them all watch him put a teacher in chains for teaching the alphabet. Let us see if Mr. Vane's railroad can run on that. She turned and started walking back to town, leaving the smoke and the ruin behind her. Mateo watched her go, the matchbook cutting into his palm. He mounted his horse, but he did not follow her. He rode east, toward Ojo Verde. The fight was no longer just about the school. It was about the water. It was about everything. The cottonwood tree was a world. Its leaves, never still, made a sound like a river in the constant wind, and its shade was a moving, dappled mercy. Beneath it, on the hard-packed earth where the burnt quill pen still stood, Eliza Hart's school began. She had 9 students that first Monday. There was Jedediah's son, young Ben, who still looked at her with his father's fearful apology. There were the blacksmith's 2 daughters, strong and loud. There was the quiet son of the mercantile owner, and there were 5 others who made the town hold its breath. 2 were Chiricahua, a boy and a girl, cousins, who had walked in from the hills just after sunrise. They wore moccasins and carried nothing. They sat at the edge of the shade, their black eyes missing nothing. The other 2 were the children of a Chinese man who worked the mining camp's laundry, a brother and sister named Tom and May. They were scrubbed clean, their black hair in neat braids, and they carried a single, shared slate. Eliza had 1 crate for a desk, a large blackboard she had paid for with the last of her Eastern money, and a box of precious, compressed chalk. The children sat on the ground. "Good morning," Eliza said, her voice bright. She wrote the letters on the board, Goodmorning. The children stared. The silence was absolute. "This," she said, pointing to the first letter, "is a G. It makes the sound G, like good." She was met with blank faces from the porch of the Paloma Saloon across the plaza. 2 of Vane's hired men watched, their chairs tilted back. Marshal Cobb stood in the doorway of his office, his arms crossed. The lesson was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Paloma, the saloon owner's wife. She was a woman of substance, draped in black silk despite the heat, and she carried a basket. She did not approach the class, but called to Eliza from a respectable distance. "Miss Hart," she said, her voice a low, concerned whisper. Eliza walked over, dusting chalk from her hands. "Good morning, Mrs. Paloma." "Child," the woman said, her eyes kind but worried, "you are courting disaster. Real disaster." She nodded toward the children. "This is not just brave. It is foolish. You are putting them in danger. You are putting us all in danger." "Learning is not dangerous, ma'am," Eliza said. "That, Mrs. Paloma said, pointing with her chin toward the 2 Chiricahua children, "is what Vane's men call a provocation, and that," she nodded toward Tom and May, "is just confusing. They are not like us. They are children, and they wish to learn. That is all I see." "Mrs. Paloma sighed, a heavy sound of frustration. "I brought you broth." "You look thin." She pushed the basket at Eliza. "But you are inviting the wolf to the door." "Child, and he will not be content to eat just you." She turned and walked away, her silk dress whispering in the dust. Eliza returned to her class, her stomach tight, as if summoned by the woman's words. 2 parents who were watching from the edge of the plaza, a man and a woman, hurried forward. They did not speak to Eliza. They grabbed their son and daughter by the arm and pulled them away, ignoring their protests. The blacksmith's daughters looked like they might be next. Their father was watching from his smithy, his hammer idle in his hand. Then Taza Naichi appeared. He was not on his pony. He was on foot, carrying his rifle in the crook of his arm. He did not come to the class. He simply walked to the far side of the plaza, near the well, and sat down on a stone bench, his back to the wall of the mercantile. He placed his rifle across his knees and began to clean it. He was a visible, silent guardian. The blacksmith saw him. He saw Vane's men watch Taza. The blacksmith turned, went back into his smithy, and the sound of his hammer on the anvil began again. A defiant, angry rhythm. His daughters were staying. Eliza let out a breath she did not know she was holding. She turned back to the board. "The letter G," she said again, her voice stronger. The next day, Mateo Crow arrived. He did not come on his dun horse. He came driving a heavy wagon, pulled by 4 draft mules. The wagon was loaded with long, straight pine posts. They were not new. They were salvaged, scarred by previous use, but they were strong. He was followed by his 2 men, Milo and Jake, in a second wagon loaded with sheets of rusted tin and boxes of tools. He did not speak to Eliza. He did not acknowledge the class, which had stopped all pretense of learning to watch him. He pulled the wagon up to the 4 pine stakes that marked her original plot. He swung down from the driver's seat, pulled a heavy mallet from the wagon bed, and walked to the first stake. With 3 precise, brutal blows, he drove it deep into the ground. Then he and his men began to unload the timber. The message was clear. The line shack was gone, but the school would be built here, in the center of town, where everyone could see. Marshal Cobb came storming out of his office. "Crow, what do you think you are doing? You do not have a permit for this." Mateo did not stop working. He and Milo were laying out the foundation beams. "It is not a commercial structure, Marshal. It is a school, protected by the charter, the one Miss Hart told you about." "This is an unlawful assembly," Cobb blustered. "This," Mateo said, finally straightening up, "is a building. Last I checked, that was still legal." He gestured with his hammer. "Unless Silas Vane has outlawed nails, too." Cobb's face went dark. He looked at Mateo, then at Taza, who was still on his bench, watching. He looked at the 2 hired guns at the saloon, who were making no move to intervene. Mateo Crow was not a lone woman. He was a landowner, and a man known to finish what he started. "You are making a mistake." "Crow!" Cobb spat. "That is my business," Mateo said, and he turned back to his work. The hammering was the new rhythm of the town. It was the percussion to Eliza's lessons. The children watched, fascinated, as the frame began to rise, a skeleton of pine against the blue sky. The pressure came on the 3rd day. The class was small, only 7 children now, but they were focused. Eliza was teaching them to write their names. Young Tom, the Chinese boy, was making his letters with a slow, perfect precision. A shot cracked through the plaza. It was loud and close. A puff of dust kicked up 10 feet from the cottonwood tree. The children screamed. The Chiricahua boy and the girl did not scream. They vanished, melting into the shadows behind the tree trunk. Young Ben burst into tears. Eliza's heart stopped. She stood frozen, the chalk in her hand. From the alley between the saloon and the livery, one of Vane's men sauntered out. He was reloading his pistol, a smirk on his face. "Sorry, folks. Hand slipped, just cleaning my weapon." Marshal Cobb was nowhere to be seen. Taza was on his feet, his rifle in his hands, but he was too far away. The man in the alley was watching Eliza, his eyes mocking her. Eliza looked at her terrified students. She looked at the man, who was now leaning against the saloon wall, waiting to see what she would do. She was afraid. Her knees were weak, a cold sickness in her stomach. She could taste the metallic tang of fear. She turned her back to the man. She turned back to the blackboard, though her hand was shaking so badly she could barely write. "The next letter," she said, her voice a strained whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the strength into her words. "The next letter is B for brave." She wrote the letter. It was crooked, but it was on the board. "You cannot learn with fear," she said, more to herself than to the children. "Fear is a poor teacher. We will not be afraid. We will learn our letters." Ben sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. The blacksmith's daughter, the older one, glared at the man in the alley. Young Tom picked up his slate and copied the B. The man in the alley laughed, a short, ugly sound. He holstered his pistol and went back inside the saloon. The immediate threat was over, but the air was different. The violence was no longer a shadow. It was here, in the plaza, in the daylight. That afternoon, she helped Mateo. The men were raising the main crossbeam for the roof. It was heavy, salvaged from the mine's scrap heap, and they were short-handed. "Miss Hart," Mateo called, his voice strained. He and his 2 men were on ladders, straining to hold the beam in place. "We need another prop, now." Eliza looked around, found a piece of 2x4, and ran to the structure. "Here," Mateo grunted, sweat pouring down his face, his muscles corded. "Under this end. I have to shift my grip." Eliza wedged herself under the massive beam, her shoulders screaming in protest, and pushed the prop into place, giving him the leverage he needed. As she did, she saw his hands. His leather gloves were torn, and the raw wood was biting into his palms. She did not think. She ran to her valise by the tree and pulled out the spare pair of work gloves her father had insisted she pack. They were thick leather, too large for her, but perfect for him. "She ran back. Your hands," she said, breathless. He looked at her, his expression tight with strain. He could not let go of the beam. Eliza took one of the thick gloves and, awkwardly, trying not to look at the raw skin, she forced it onto his free hand. Her fingers brushed his calloused, open palm. It was only for a second. His hand was hot, rough, and alive. A shock went through her, sudden and powerful, like touching a hot wire. It had nothing to do with gentleness. It was a jolt of pure, unadorned strength. He looked at her. His dark eyes, usually so guarded, were wide for just a moment, startled by the same current. He did not speak. He just grunted, shifted his grip, now gloved, and with a great heave, settled the beam into place. Eliza stepped back, her hand tingling. She felt the heat rise in her face and turned away, hoping the dust and the shadows of the new frame hid her expression. The next day, Taza Naichi spoke to the class. He had approached, not as a guardian, but as a participant. He stood under the tree, holding a piece of smooth, gray stone. The children, even the town children, were drawn to him. He had a stillness that commanded attention. "You learn words," he said, his voice quiet, looking at Eliza's blackboard. "That is one way my people learn, the earth." He held up the stone. "This stone," he said, "is a book. It tells of the river that made it smooth. It tells of the mountain it came from." He knelt, and the children gathered around him. He told them the legend of the stone deer, a deer that was so quiet, so patient, that it learned to listen to the rocks. It learned where the water hid. It learned where the good grass grew. It learned where the lion waited. "To learn," Taza said, his gaze moving over the silent children, "is to listen, not just with ears." He tapped his chest. "Here, and with your feet. The earth speaks. You must be quiet enough to hear it." The children were spellbound. This was not letters. This was magic. But it was real. They looked at the dust they sat on with new eyes. Eliza watched, a sense of profound humility washing over her. She was teaching them to read words. He was teaching them to read the world. That lesson in observation paid off 2 days later. Eliza had set the children a task to keep a small journal, to draw or write one thing they saw each day. Young Tom, the Chinese boy, had taken to it with a passion. His journal was a small, neat logbook. He approached her shyly. "Miss Hart, the wagons." "What wagons?" "Tom." He pointed to his log. He had drawn them. Heavy wagons, with barrels. They go by late, not with the coal. After dark, I see them from my window. 3 nights, very slow. They smell bad. Eliza looked at his drawing. "Barrels. What kind of smell, Tom?" "Like tar," he said, wrinkling his nose. "The tar for the roofs." Eliza felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. tar, the heavy, acrid smell from the fire. The line shack had been wood. This new school, Mateo's school, was wood. Tar was for a fire that was meant to burn hot, fast, and completely. They were planning to burn it again. That night, she sat in her small room behind the mercantile. The fear was back. A heavy, suffocating blanket. She was not just afraid for herself or the school. She was afraid for Mateo, who was pouring his strength into that building. She was afraid for Taza, who put himself in the open. She was afraid for the children. She took out a letter she had received from her mother. She had read it a dozen times. It was full of warnings, of pleas to come home, to leave that savage place. Do not involve yourself with the Indians, her mother had written. They are not our kind. It will only end in sorrow. No good can come of it. Eliza looked at the letter, at the familiar, loving script. She thought of Taza teaching the children to listen to the earth. She thought of Mateo's bleeding hand and the jolt of life that had passed between them. She was terrified, but the anger that had been born in the ashes of the line shack was stronger. It was a cold, pure fury at the lies. The lie that Taza was a savage. The lie that Mateo was just a cold-hearted rancher. The lie that Vane's progress was anything but theft. She folded her mother's letter. She did not tear it up. She just folded it and put it back in the envelope. She would not be sending a reply. Not tonight. Across town, Mateo Crow sat on the porch of the small adobe house he kept in town, a house he rarely used. He was cleaning his carbine, the same one that had sat on the saloon table. The new school frame stood across the plaza, a dark grid against the stars. He was all the way in. He had told himself he was just offering scrap wood, a temporary fix, but he had put his hands on it. He had started to build it. He had seen her stand up to that hired gun. He had felt her hand on his. He was torn. He remembered his time as a scout. He remembered the smell of burning villages. He remembered the cold, efficient cruelty of the federal troops, men who looked just like Vane's men, men who believed in progress and unified land. He had sworn he would never again be part of a fight that was not his. He would stay quiet. He would keep his land. He would tend his herd. He would let the rusted parts of his soul stay rusted. But Eliza Hart, with her chalk dust and her impossible, foolish courage, was polishing that rust. She was making him see that his silence was just another kind of surrender. He did not want to stand with her. It was the most dangerous thing he could do. But he knew, as he sighted down the clean, dark barrel of his rifle, that he could no longer stand anywhere else. The walls were up. They were rough, mismatched planks of pine, scarred with old nail holes and the rust stains of tin. But they were walls. Mateo Crow, Milo, and Jake had worked with a grim, furious energy. They had salvaged the wood from the mine's scrap heap, hauling it in the dead of night. The school now stood in the center of the plaza, a defiant, unpainted box. It had a real tin roof and 2 framed openings for windows, though there was no glass. Eliza had continued her lessons under the cottonwood, her voice competing with the constant, hopeful sound of Mateo's hammer. The town watched. The balance had shifted. This was no longer a woman's folly. This was a building. They finished the last wall late in the afternoon. The sky, which had been a cloudless, searing blue for months, had turned a deep, bruised purple. The air was thick and still, heavy with a silence that was almost as loud as the hammering had been. The smell of ozone and wet dust filled the plaza. "That is it, boss," Milo said, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead. "She is as strong as she is going to get." Mateo drove the last nail, his arm moving with powerful, rhythmic economy. He stepped back to look at their work. The first drop of rain hit the tin roof. It made a sound like a pistol shot, sharp and loud, echoing across the plaza. And then the sky tore open. It was not a gentle, civilized rain. It was a high desert deluge, a violent unburdening. The clouds unleashed a solid, cold sheet of water. The dust of the plaza vanished in seconds, replaced by a churning sea of red mud. "Get the tools under the wagon," Mateo shouted to his men, who were already scrambling. Eliza had been trying to help, stacking leftover scraps of wood. She was soaked to the skin in an instant. Her thin wool dress, the only one she had of any practicality, became a sodden, heavy weight. The mud sucked at her boots, and the temperature plummeted. A cold wind came with the rain, cutting through her wet clothes. She began to shiver, a deep, uncontrollable shaking that started in her bones. I am fine," she stammered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. She tried to pick up a handsaw, but her fingers were blue and numb. "You are freezing," Mateo said. His voice was flat, annoyed. He strode over to her, his own coat dark with rain. He did not bother with the tools. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip hard. "Come on!" He pulled her toward the new schoolhouse. The rain was hammering on the tin roof, a deafening, chaotic roar. He shoved her under the small overhang of the roof, but the wind was driving the rain sideways, and it offered almost no shelter. "This will not do," he said, his voice a low growl against the storm. He looked around, then grabbed a large, heavy canvas tarp from the bed of his wagon. He wrestled the stiff, wet canvas, pulling it into the schoolhouse doorway. He draped it over a new, unpainted crossbeam. Securing it against the new wall, it created a small, dry pocket, a tiny cave against the storm. "In here," he commanded, pushing her into the dark space. She huddled against the new pine wall. It smelled of fresh-cut wood and resin, but the cold was inside her now. The shivering was violent, racking her whole body. She could not stop it. Mateo stood in the rain, watching her. His face was grim in the gray, watery light. He seemed to be arguing with himself, his jaw tight. He swore, a single, sharp word that was ripped away by the wind. He stepped into the small, dark space with her. "Mr. Crow," Eliza began. Startled, the space was barely big enough for one person. She was pressed against the back wall. "Be quiet," he said. He was very close. He was a wall of heat. He turned, blocking the wind with his own body. The space was filled with him. He put his arms around her, his movements sure and impersonal, and pulled her against his chest. Eliza went rigid. This was scandalous. This was everything. Her hands were trapped between them. She was pressed against the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. His coat was wet, but the warmth radiating from him was astonishing. He smelled of wet leather, sage, and the metallic scent of the rain. "Stop fighting me, Eliza!" he muttered into her hair. His voice was rough. "It is just heat. You will freeze." He held her. He was not gentle, but he was firm. It was not an embrace. It was a furnace. Her head was tucked under his chin, her ear pressed against the rough wool of his coat. She could feel his heart beating, a slow, steady, powerful rhythm beneath her ear. It was the calmest sound in the world, a counterpoint to the wild drumming of the rain on the roof and the frantic hammering of her own pulse. The violent shivering began to ease. The cold in her bones met the heat from his body, and the warmth began to win. The shaking softened. She let out a breath she had been holding for an hour, for a week, for her whole life. She relaxed, just a fraction, and let her weight rest against him. She tilted her head back. She meant to thank him. Her face was only inches from his. His dark eyes were looking down at her, and the usual guard, the iron shield, was gone. He was not assessing her. He was not judging her. He was seeing her. The rain, the cold, the school, the danger, it all faded away. There was only this small, dark, warm space and the sudden, terrifying stillness in his gaze. He lowered his head. It was a slow, deliberate movement. He was not asking, but he was giving her time to turn away. She could not. She lifted her chin. The rancher's kiss was nothing she could have ever imagined. It was not the rough, desperate kiss of a saloon story, nor the polite, chaste peck of a Sunday social. It was firm and warm, and tasted of the rain. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, a promise sealed without a single word. It was not a kiss of passion, but of fact. It lasted only a moment, but it settled the foundation of the schoolhouse and every part of her world. He lifted his head. He did not apologize. He did not look away. His eyes searched hers. "Mateo," she whispered, the name a small, breathless sound. He nodded. Once, his expression serious. "Eliza." It was a compact. It was a pledge. He was no longer just helping her. He was standing with her. And Eliza Hart, who had come to build a school, knew in that moment that she trusted this quiet, complicated man with her life. He was, she realized, a man of profound and hidden goodness. The deluge ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving a clean, cold world and a sky of washed-out gray. But the end of the rain only cleared the air for Vane's next attack. It was no longer just random violence. It became a calculated strangulation. First, the supply of finished lumber from Santa Fe stopped. The freight driver, a man who had always been friendly, would not meet Eliza's eyes. "Sorry, ma'am. New orders. We are not allowed to haul for Santa Mauro, less it is for the Vane Mining Company." Then the small ranchers found the salt deliveries were cut off. It was a vital supply for their cattle. Mateo's herds were fine. His spring had a natural salt lick. But his neighbors, men like Jedediah, were being starved out. Then came the newspaper. A man in a city suit with a slick vest and a notebook had arrived from the territorial capital. He spent 2 hours drinking whiskey with Marshal Cobb in the Paloma Saloon. 1 week later, the Santa Fe Examiner arrived. Eliza saw it tacked up in the Mercantile. The headline was in thick, black letters. "Missouri teacher incites racial agitation, and under it schoolmistress harbors savages, endangers settlers." The article called her a naive and dangerous radical, accusing her of filling the heads of children with dangerous notions and providing a safe haven for Apache renegades. A clear, vicious reference to Taza. The town, which had been slowly warming to the school, turned cold again overnight. They met on Boulder Ridge, the three of them. The night was cold, the air sharp. The newspaper lay on a flat rock between them, the firelight making the words flicker. "He is making me an outlaw," Eliza said, her voice tight with a fury that burned away her fear. "He is twisting the law to make me the criminal." "He is preparing the ground," Mateo said. He was cleaning his rifle, his hands moving with efficient, angry motions. "He is making the town afraid of you, so when he moves, they will call it justice." "He uses paper," Taza said. He had been silent, staring at the offensive article. He touched it with the tip of his knife, as if it were something poisonous. "We must use his weapon." "The treaty," Eliza said, looking at Taza. "And the matchbook," she added, looking at Mateo. "It is not enough to have them," Mateo said. "We must show them to someone Vane cannot buy. Cobb is his man. The governor is too far away, and Vane's money is long." "Circuit Judge Monroe," Eliza said, the name coming to her. She had heard the men in the Mercantile speak of him. "He is due in 2 weeks. They say he is hard. They say he is honest." Mateo stopped cleaning his rifle. He nodded slowly. "Monroe, I know of him. He served with the army. He fears no one, and he follows the book." "Then that is our plan," Eliza said, the energy of the fight surging back into her. "We do not wait for Vane's next move. We bring the trial to him. We will present the treaty map and the Vane matchbook to Judge Monroe, in public, in front of the entire town. We need more than paper," Eliza continued, her mind racing. "Vane says the school is a danger. He says the children are agitated and savage. I will show the town what the school truly is." "What do you mean?" Mateo asked. "A public reading," she said, a small, fierce smile touching her lips. "The children, all of them, Tom and May, the blacksmith's daughters, Ben, and—" She turned to Taza. "Your cousins. If they are willing, they will stand in the plaza, in front of the judge, and they will read. They will read from the primer. They will read from the territorial charter. We will let the town see Vane's ignorant savages read the very law he is breaking." Taza was quiet for a long time. He stared into the embers, his face carved from shadow and pride. "My people," he said, his voice low and tight. "The children, they are not a show, not a card for you to play." Eliza's heart ached. She saw his fear, the centuries of betrayal he carried. She reached out, slowly, and placed her hand on his arm. He tensed, but did not pull away. "Taza Naiche, look at me," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. He met her gaze. "No one," she said, "is a prop in this classroom. Not your cousins, not Tom, not Ben. They are not a show. They are the proof. They are the reason. Vane says they are less than human. I will show the judge that they are the future. It is their voice, not mine. That will prove him a liar." He searched her face in the firelight. He saw no deceit. He saw only the terrible, bright honesty of the teacher. He gave a single sharp nod. "They will read." The plan was a weapon. It gave them hope, but they had underestimated Cobb's simple malice. 2 days later, Taza rode into town to fill his water skin. It was midday. The children were gathered around Eliza by the new schoolhouse, practicing their letters on their slates. Mateo was on the roof, hammering the last of the tin sheets into place. Marshal Cobb stepped out of his office. He was not alone. He was flanked by 2 of Vane's hired men, the same 2 who had watched Eliza from the saloon porch. "Taza Naiche," Cobb boomed, his hand on his pistol. "You are under arrest." Taza's pony stopped. Taza's own hand moved to the rifle across his lap. "For what?" "Trespassing," Cobb said, enjoying the moment. He held up a piece of paper. "I have a sworn complaint from Mr. Silas Vane. You have been seen on his claim, near the Ojo Verde, and for vagrancy, and for inciting public fear. Get off the horse. Apache, hands high." "I go where my people have always gone," Taza said, his voice a low, cold thread of sound. "Not anymore." Cobb sneered. "That is Vane's land now, and you are coming with me." He and his men drew their pistols. On the roof, Mateo froze. His hammer was in his hand. His rifle was on the ground, leaning against the wall. "No!" Eliza shouted, dropping her chalk. She ran forward, putting herself between Cobb and Taza. "Marshal, you cannot. This is a lie. He has done nothing." "Get out of the way, Miss Hart," Cobb snarled, "or I will arrest you, too, for interfering. This is official business." Taza looked at Eliza's back. He looked up at Mateo, who was now climbing down the ladder, his movements slow and deliberate, his face a mask of cold fury. Taza saw the odds. 3 guns on him, more in the saloon, and the children were watching, their small faces pale with terror. To fight here was to start a war. Slowly, his face rigid with a pride that was deeper than anger, Taza Naiche raised his hands. He swung his leg over the pony and dismounted. Cobb's men seized him. They wrenched his arms behind his back, tied his wrists with a rawhide thong, and shoved him toward the small, dark cell behind the marshal's office. "We must stop this," Eliza said, grabbing Mateo's arm as he reached the ground. "It is not right." "Not like this," Mateo said, his voice a low growl. He put his hand over hers, his grip like iron. He stopped her from running after them. "He is arrested, not shot. It is what they want. They want us to draw. We will get him out, but we will do it with the law, not with a gun." That night, Mateo met with Milo and Jake in his small town adobe. "The judge is our only play," Mateo said, his face grim. "Vane knows he is coming. I need to get to him before he reaches San Amaro, before Cobb can poison him. He is coming up the South Trail, from Fort Stanton," Milo said. He was the older of the two, steady and quiet. "Should be here by Tuesday." "Jake," Mateo said, turning to the younger man. Jake had been with him for 5 years. He was quick-witted and a good shot. "I want you to ride south. Now, meet the judge on the trail. Give him this." Mateo handed him a sealed envelope. It contained Eliza's copy of the treaty map and a short, direct letter. "Tell him what is happening. Tell him Taza Naichi is a political prisoner." "You got it, boss," Jake said, his face eager. "I will ride out right now. I will find him." "Good man," Mateo said, clapping him on the shoulder. An hour later, Jake was not riding south. He was riding east, toward the mining camp. He was met in the dark by one of Vane's managers. "Well," the manager asked, handing Jake a small, heavy leather bag. Jake tested the weight of the coins. His smile flashed in the dark. He took the bait. "Crow is sending me south. He thinks Monroe is coming from Fort Stanton. He even sent a letter." The manager chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Good. Let him. Marshal Cobb has already sent a rider to Santa Fe. He will warn the judge about the Apache trouble and advise him to take the North Road instead. We will have a reception waiting for him. And for Crow, if he tries to find him." The next morning, the plaza was thick with dread. Taza was in jail. The children were frightened. Eliza walked to the new schoolhouse. The walls were up, the roof was on, but it felt empty. She reached into her valise and pulled out a small, brass handbell. It had been her mother's. Used to call the family to supper. It was one of the few things she had left that tied her to her old life. She took a hammer and a single nail. She walked to the open, unpainted doorway. Mateo was across the plaza, watching her. He had not slept. He looked tired, and he looked dangerous. Eliza placed the nail against the new pine door frame. With 3 firm, steady blows, she hammered it in. She hung the small bell from the nail. She reached up and, with one finger, rang it. The sound was small, but it was high and clear. It cut through the heavy, silent air of the plaza. Ting. The children looked up. Mateo looked up. Even Marshal Cobb, from his office, looked out the window. Eliza spoke, her voice not loud, but carrying in the clear morning. "When this bell rings," she said, "it means the lesson has begun. It means words are winning. It means ignorance is over. They can burn our books. They can lock up our friends. But they cannot stop this bell. They cannot stop the words." She rang it again. Ting, a small, fragile, unbreakable sound. The night before the judge was due to arrive. San Amaro held its breath. There was a false calm, a stillness in the air that was heavier than the one before the rain. Mateo Crow had not slept for 2 days. He had sent Jake south, trusting the man he had ridden with for 5 years. Now, there was nothing to do but wait. He sat in the shadows of the livery stable, across from the school, his carbine resting across his lap. He was watching the alleys. Eliza was in her small room, packing her valise, not to flee, but to be ready for the morning. She had the children's copybooks, the slates with their practiced letters, and her own worn copy of the territorial charter. She had Taza's map, given to her by Mateo for safekeeping, folded into a packet with the Vane matchbook from the first fire. She had practiced her speech, the words she would say to Judge Monroe. The attack came just after 2 in the morning, when the moon was down and the town was sunk in its deepest sleep. They did not come with stealth. They came with the arrogance of men who believed the law was on their side. 4 of them, led by the man who had shot at Eliza in the plaza. They carried heavy barrels, just as young Tom had described. The smell of tar rolled ahead of them, a foul, acrid promise. Mateo was on his feet before they reached the center of the plaza. "That is far enough," his voice called out, a low, hard sound from the darkness of the livery. The men stopped. They laughed. "It is just the rancher." The leader sneered. "He is all alone." "I am here," Mateo said. He stepped from the shadows. His carbine held level. "The school is not burning tonight." "It is. Crow," the man said. "The judge needs to see what a nuisance this thing is. A fire hazard. We are just cleaning up the town." He and another man started to pry the lid from a barrel. Mateo fired. He did not aim at the man. He aimed at the barrel. The bullet struck the metal hoop with a high, screaming clang. It tore a splinter from the wood. Tar began to ooze. "The next one is for you," Mateo said, his voice cold as iron. The men scattered, dropping the barrels and drawing their pistols. Gunfire erupted in the plaza, the shots deafeningly loud, echoing off the adobe walls. The sound of the first shot, that sharp clang of metal on metal, jerked Eliza from her half-sleep. She smelled the tar. She was out of her room in an instant, not even bothering with her boots, running in her stocking feet. She did not run toward the fight. She did not run away. She ran to the school. The new, raw pine frame stood in the plaza, caught between the flashes of gunfire. She ran to the doorway and grabbed the small, brass bell. She began to ring it. She rang it not as a call to lesson, but as an alarm, a desperate cry for help. Ting, 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 the high, clear, frantic sound cut through the shouting and the gunshots. In the cell behind the marshal's office, Taza Naiche came to his feet. He had been waiting. He had heard the confrontation. He smelled the tar. He heard Eliza's bell. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that they were burning the school, the place where his cousins had finally been seen as human. Marshal Cobb was not in his office. He was across the street, in the Paloma Saloon, establishing his alibi with Vane's manager, the one deputy he had left on guard. A lazy, frightened man had run out at the first shot, his pistol in his hand, yelling for the marshal. The cell was dark, but the adobe wall was soft. The rain from the day before had soaked the foundation. Taza had been working on a loose stone near the floor for hours. He put his shoulder to the wall. His feet braced. He heard the gunfire, the bell, and now a new, horrifying sound, the whoosh of the tar catching fire. He pushed. The adobe mortar gave way. He was out, scrambling into the dark alley behind the office. In the plaza, the school was burning. The men had managed to splash 2 barrels against the north wall before Mateo's shot. The tar-fed flames shot up, licking the new tin roof, turning the plaza an apocalyptic orange. Mateo was pinned down behind the blacksmith's water trough. 2 men were firing at him, while the other 2 worked to spread the fire. One of the men, his face lit by the blaze, was Frank, a man who had ridden with Mateo in the Scouts, a man who had shared his fire and his whiskey. "Frank!" Mateo yelled, the name torn from him, a sound of pure betrayal. Frank looked over, his pistol hot in his hand. "This is Vane's town now. Crow should have sold when you had the chance." He fired, the bullet whining off the trough, sending a spray of water and splinters into Mateo's face. Eliza kept ringing the bell. Ting, ting, ting. She was frantic, her arm aching. She saw the women of the town, their faces pale in their windows. Mrs. Paloma, Jedediah's wife. "Water!" Eliza screamed at them, her voice raw. "Help me, buckets. It is not just the school, it is the town." The fire was roaring. It was a living thing, greedy and loud. The townspeople were frozen, trapped between their fear of Vane's men and the fire that threatened to swallow their homes. Taza Naiche burst from the alley. He was not armed, but he moved with a purpose that was more dangerous than any gun. He saw the remaining tar barrels, 2 of them, sitting near the fire, the heat already starting to make them smoke. They were bombs. He ignored the shooters. He ran straight into the open plaza, a target for everyone. A bullet from Frank's gun tore through the flesh of his upper arm. A hot, searing pain. He did not slow down. He grabbed a skinning knife from the belt of a fallen hired gun, one Mateo had hit in the leg. With a strength born of pure rage, Taza cut the ropes holding the barrels on their small cart. He put his shoulder to the first one, the one leaking from Mateo's bullet, and rolled it. He did not roll it toward the water. He rolled it away from the school, onto the open, muddy ground that had been soaked by the rain. He kicked it over, the tar spilling across the wet grass, where it would burn itself out harmlessly. He went back for the second one, the bullets snapping around him. He did the same, rolling it away, spilling its fuel, starving the greater fire. Eliza had inspired a few. Old Jedediah, his face a mask of terror, ran out with a horse blanket. The blacksmith followed with 2 buckets. A human chain was forming. "Here to the well," Eliza commanded, her voice the only sane thing in the chaos. She was organizing the women, the children, even young Tom and May, who had run from their home. They were passing buckets, blankets, anything that would hold water. Mateo used Taza's diversion. He left the trough, running low, and tackled Frank from the side. The 2 men went down in the red mud, a knot of old loyalties and new betrayals. Frank was strong, but Mateo was fighting for his soul. "You burned them out," Mateo roared, his voice thick with the memory of the scout days, the burning villages. "You are still burning them?" "It is just a job." "Crow," Frank gasped, trying to bring his pistol up. "Not this one," Mateo snarled. He saw the glint of a knife in Frank's other hand. The blade came up, slashing across Mateo's left shoulder, finding the old scar, the one that had pained him for a decade. A white-hot fire, colder and sharper than the burning school, shot through him. The past and present collapsed. He cried out, a sound of agony, and with a surge of pure, dark strength, he brought his fist down, breaking Frank's jaw. The man went limp. At the same moment, the fire reached its peak. A tongue of yellow flame leaped up the doorframe of the school, engulfing the small, brass bell. The heat was immense. The rope holding the bell snapped. A wave of sparks and burning embers flew into the air. The bell fell, striking the stone threshold. The clear, hopeful ting was gone. It landed in the mud, cracked and silent. The sound of the bell stopping was more shocking than the gunfire. Eliza stared at it, her hand still in the air, her face streaked with soot and tears. The silence that followed was broken by a new sound. A heavy wagon, the clatter of shod hooves and the jingle of harness. A buggy, escorted by 2 armed men in territorial uniform, rolled into the plaza. It stopped. A tall man in a black coat, his face like carved granite, stepped down. He looked at the burning building. He looked at the armed men, some groaning on the ground. He looked at the human bucket brigade. He looked at the silent, bleeding Apache warrior standing over the spilled tar. He looked at the rancher, Mateo Crow, climbing to his feet, his shirt black with blood, holding his wounded shoulder. Judge Monroe had arrived. Marshal Cobb came running from the saloon, his face a mask of false panic. Judge Monroe, thank God! You see what these savages have done the Apache. Taza Naiche. He escaped. He led this. They burned the school." The judge's eyes, cold and blue, surveyed the scene. He saw the barrels. He saw the spilled tar. One of Vane's men, the one who had shot at Eliza before, was trying to crawl away. As he scrambled, a small, square object fell from his vest pocket. It landed in the mud, near Eliza's feet. Eliza bent down. Her hand was shaking. She picked it up. It was another matchbook, identical to the one from the first fire, stamped with the black V of Vane's company. "No, Marshal," Eliza said, her voice shaking but carrying in the sudden, vast silence. She stepped forward, into the firelight, holding the matchbook up for the judge to see. They did not burn it. He did, Mr. Vane's men did. She pointed at the man on the ground. She pointed at the barrels. They came with tar, just as they did at the line shack. I have the proof from that fire, too. Cobb sputtered. That proves nothing. It is a plant I arrested that Apache for trespassing. He is the arsonist. Taza Naiche walked forward. He was bleeding freely from his arm, but his spine was straight. He walked past Eliza, past Mateo, and stopped 10 feet from Cobb. He looked the marshal in the eye. His voice was not loud, but every person in the plaza heard every single, distinct word. We are the victims. The town was silent. They had seen it all. They had seen Taza spill the tar away from the fire. They had seen Mateo fight. They had seen Eliza ring the bell. Judge Monroe's gaze was ice. He looked at Cobb. Marshal, you will explain to me why your only prisoner is bleeding in the plaza, and why the men who work for Silas Vane are the ones holding the guns and the tar. The fire was dying. The rain-soaked mud and the desperate work of the townsfolk had saved the plaza. But the school was a ruin. The walls were standing, blackened, scorched skeletons of pine. The tin roof was buckled and twisted from the heat. It was not gone, but it was wounded, deeply. Eliza looked at the bell, cracked and muddy at her feet. The adrenaline left her, and the cold, sick fear rushed in. She saw Mateo, his face pale, his hand clamped to his shoulder, the blood running thick between his fingers. She saw Taza, his arm slick with his own blood, standing defiant but hurt. She had been so angry, so focused on the building, on the law. She had not realized the true cost. She had asked them to stand with her. She had never known, until this moment, what it would feel like to lose them. Mateo, she whispered, her voice breaking. She stumbled toward him, her hands reaching out. He caught her with his one good arm, pulling her against his side. He was breathing heavily, the pain a grim line around his mouth, but his eyes were on the school. It is standing, Eliza, he rasped, his voice rough with smoke and pain. Look, they did not knock it down. It is still standing. She looked through the smoke and the first pale gray light of dawn. She saw the frame, charred, black, and ruined. But standing, it was still standing. Judge Monroe's voice was the only thing in the plaza that was not burning or bleeding. It was a cold, hard instrument, and it cut through the chaos, smoke, and groans. Marshal Cobb, the judge said, his voice flat. He had taken in the scene in less than 10 seconds. You will surrender your weapon and your badge to my officer. Your Honor, I can explain, Cobb sputtered, his face a mask of sweat and panic. It was the Apache. He escaped. You will be silent, Monroe said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. One of his uniformed escorts stepped forward, and a stunned, defeated Cobb handed over his pistol and the tarnished star. You, ma'am, the judge said, his gaze falling on Eliza. His eyes went to the matchbook in her hand. And you, Mr. Crow, and you, Taza Naiche. My inquiry begins in 1 hour. In the saloon, I suggest. His eyes went to Mateo's bloody shoulder and Taza's arm. You find a way to stop bleeding before then. With that, he turned and strode into the Paloma saloon, his men flanking him, leaving the town of San Amaro to stare at the smoldering, skeletal ruin of its school. The Paloma saloon, at 7 in the morning, became a courtroom. The poker tables were dragged together. Judge Monroe sat at the head, a pitcher of water and one clean glass in front of him. The entire town packed the room, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale, their clothes still smelling of smoke. Silas Vane was there. He had been invited by the judge's armed escorts. He sat at a small table, flanked by his mine manager and a thin, sharp man in a city suit who was Vane's lawyer. Vane looked calm, his suit pressed, as if he were observing a minor business inconvenience. Across the room sat Eliza, Mateo, and Taza. Eliza had used the blacksmith's whiskey and a strip of her own petticoat to create a crude, tight bandage for Mateo's shoulder. He was pale, his face carved in lines of pain, but he was upright. Taza had refused her help, binding his own arm with a leather thong, his face a mask of indifference. "This court is now in session," Judge Monroe announced to the packed room. "I am here to investigate a series of disturbances, culminating in the attempted destruction of this town. I will hear from Mr. Vane first." Vane's lawyer stood, his voice smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Silas Vane, is a victim here. He came to this territory to bring the railroad, to bring prosperity. He has been met with resistance, chaos, and violence, all of it centered around this school." Vane himself rose. He was an impressive man, his voice a deep, reasonable baritone. "Your Honor, this is a tragedy, but a predictable one. The teacher, Miss Hart, with the best of intentions, has created a flashpoint. She has incited the populace, encouraging the mixture of settlers and savages." He motioned toward Taza. "The result is last night's riot. This school is a danger. It is a threat to the safety and security of this town. I have here," he produced a sheaf of papers, "land contracts, agreements from local landowners to consolidate their holdings to make way for the railroad. Progress. The only holdout is Mr. Crow, who is illegally occupying land that includes the Ojo Verde Spring. This entire affair is a dispute over property, one that Miss Hart's agitation has turned violent." The judge listened, his face impassive. He looked at Eliza. "Miss Hart, your response." Eliza stood. Her dress was torn, her hands black with soot, her hair falling from its pins. She looked at Vane, her eyes burning. "That is a lie," she said, her voice clear and carrying. "The school is not the cause of the violence. It is the target. Mr. Vane does not want progress. He wants ignorance. He wants to burn the school, not because it is dangerous, but because it is working." She placed her evidence on the table, the charred Vane matchbook from the line shack, and the second one, the one that had fallen from his man's pocket last night. "His men came with tar, Your Honor. They came to destroy the school before you could arrive." "Circumstantial," the lawyer scoffed. "This is not," Eliza said. She untied a leather string from her valise and unrolled Taza's buckskin map. A gasp went through the room. "This is a map of a federal treaty. It shows that the Ojo Verde Spring is not Mr. Vane's to take, nor Mr. Crow's to own. It is protected land for the use of the Chiricahua people. Mr. Vane's contracts," she tapped the paper, "are fraudulent." The judge leaned forward, his eyes intense, studying the map. "And about that tar judge," Mateo said, his voice a low rasp. He rose with effort, his good hand resting on the table to steady himself. He pulled a ledger from his coat. "Mr. Vane's mine keeps excellent records. This is their transport log. I retrieved it from their office this morning while they were distracted." A low murmur went through the crowd. "It shows 3 wagons," Mateo continued, "loaded with roofing pitch, signed out at midnight, for 3 nights in a row. The same wagons my witness reported." "Your witness," Vane's lawyer snapped, his composure slipping. "What witness?" Eliza turned and nodded toward the back of the saloon. The crowd parted. Young Tom, his face scrubbed clean, walked forward. His sister, May, held his hand until the last moment. He was clutching his slate. "This boy," Vane sneered. "He is a child. He is the son of a Chinese laborer. He cannot even testify." "He can read, Mr. Vane," Eliza said, her voice shaking with a cold, pure pride, "which is the very thing you tried to burn." The cracked blackboard had been dragged in and leaned against the bar. On it, Eliza had written a single line. "Tom," Eliza said gently, "please tell the judge what you wrote in your journal. Tell him what you saw." Tom looked at the judge, at Vane, and then at the blackboard. He took a shaky breath, and then he read, His voice was small, but in the dead silent room, it was as clear as a bell. October, 10 p.m., wagon, number 361, barrels, tar. He then walked to Mateo's ledger, which was open on the table. He put his small finger on a line and read again. October, 10 p.m., wagon, number 361, barrels, tar. He looked up at the judge. I saw them. The silence in the saloon was profound. The lesson had become the evidence. Judge Monroe's face was like granite. Marshal Cobb, who had been trying to shrink into the wall, stumbled forward. I did not know. Judge, I swear, I was at the saloon. I got a bad report about your route. That is all. A bad report? The judge's voice was lethal. Or the report you were paid to give you sent a rider to Santa Fe? Did you not, Marshal, to warn me about Apache trouble on the South Road, to advise me to take the North Road instead? Cobb's face went white. I was concerned for your safety, Your Honor. Concerned, the judge thundered, rising to his feet. Or conspiring. Conspiring to rout me into an ambush, or just to delay me to make sure you and Mr. Vane had time to destroy the evidence. He pointed at the burned-out school. Before I arrived. No, Cobb shouted, real terror in his eyes. It was not me, it was me, a voice yelled from the back of the room. The crowd gasped and turned. It was Jake, Mateo's man. He pushed his way forward, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stumbled, not looking at the judge, but at Mateo. Mateo tensed, the betrayal a fresh, cold wound on top of his physical one. Boss, Mateo, I am sorry. Jake choked out. He was crying, tears of shame cutting through the grime on his face. He paid me, Vane's manager. He paid me. Jake threw a heavy leather poke bag on the table. It landed with a solid, heavy clink of coins. He paid me to lie, to tell you I was riding south. He told me they were just going to scare the judge, make him turn back. I did not know they were going to burn the school. I swear. He looked at Judge Monroe. They knew you were coming. They knew you were supposed to come from the south. Cobb was supposed to send you north. They had men waiting. Jake's shaking fingers fumbled with the drawstring of the bag. He tore off a small, leaden seal. It came with this, as a guarantee. He tossed the seal onto the table. It spun and landed next to the Vane matchbooks. It was stamped with the same, identical V. The saloon erupted. Men were shouting, cursing Vane, Mrs. Paloma screamed. Vane's lawyer was on his feet, objecting, but his voice was lost. Silence! Judge Monroe roared. Slamming the flat of his hand on the table, the room, shaking with adrenaline and rage, fell quiet. The judge stood to his full height. This is no longer a territorial inquiry. This is a preliminary criminal hearing. He pointed at Silas Vane and his manager. You two are under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, intimidation, and attempted murder. He pointed at Cobb. You are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and gross dereliction of duty. He pointed at Frank and the other Vane gunmen, who were being guarded by the blacksmith. They will stand trial. He surveyed the room. My authority here is absolute. I am suspending Marshal Cobb's authority indefinitely. My officer will act as temporary marshal. I am placing this town under the formal protection of the territorial court. He looked at Eliza, Mateo, and Taza. A final, binding hearing will be held in Santa Fe in exactly 7 days. At that time, this treaty, he tapped the map, will be validated. Until then, I am issuing a court order. This school, he pointed to the charred frame, is a crime scene. It is protected. This spring, Ojo Verde, is likewise protected. No man will touch either one. This injunction is effective immediately. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Eliza and Mateo said, the words a breathless exhale. The judge's men moved in. clapping irons on a silent, white-faced Silas Vane and a sputtering Marshal Cobb. The townspeople began to pour out of the saloon, the impossible victory short-circuiting their fear. But Vane's lawyer did not move. He waited until the judge had left the room. He smiled at Eliza, a thin, cold smile that held no humor. A temporary victory. Miss Hart, he said, adjusting his cuffs. 7 days. The judge has a long ride to Santa Fe, and my client has many friends who believe in the railroad. He nodded at Mateo. That injunction protects the spring from lawyers. It does not protect it from squatters or from dynamite. This is not over. He tipped his hat and sauntered out, leaving Eliza and Mateo in the sudden, echoing quiet of the saloon. The elation of the victory vanished, replaced by a cold dread. Vane was not beaten. He was only delayed. The lawyer was right. Vane would not wait 7 days. He would go for the water. Eliza turned to Mateo. The adrenaline was gone, and she saw him clearly. He was leaning heavily on the table, his face ashen, the bandage on his shoulder soaked completely through with fresh, dark blood. Mateo, she breathed, the panic rising. You must sit now. He slumped into a chair, his good hand gripping the wood, his head hanging. It is bad, he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. She ran behind the bar, pushing past a stunned Mrs. Paloma. She grabbed a fresh bottle of whiskey and a stack of clean bar towels. She knelt in front of him. This is not my expertise, Mr. Crow. He gave a short, painful laugh. Just do it, Eliza. She took a breath and gently, her hands shaking, peeled the soaked rag from the wound. It was worse than she had imagined. The knife had laid the flesh open along the old, puckered scar. It was deep and it was bleeding, a slow, steady pulse. Hold on, she whispered. She poured the raw whiskey directly into the wound. Mateo did not scream. He inhaled, a sharp, ragged sound that was almost a sob. His entire body went rigid. His good hand clenched the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He bowed his head, his teeth gritted, sweat pouring from his face. Eliza worked, her heart breaking at the sight of his pain. This was not the kiss in the rain. This was not the light touch of a glove. This was intimate, a terrible, necessary violence. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch surprisingly sure. She folded the clean towels into a thick compress and began to bind his shoulder, wrapping the linen strips tightly around his chest and arm, creating a strong, supportive bandage. She finished, tying the knot. Her hands, stained with his blood, lingered on his good shoulder. He was shaking, but the bleeding had slowed. He raised his head, his eyes, dark with pain, met hers. They were closer than they had ever been. The fire and the fight had burned away the last of their defenses. Thank you, he rasped. You are a good man, Mateo Crow, she whispered, her own tears, the ones she had held back, finally falling. You are the best man I have ever known. He wanted to reach for her. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that he was a rusted, broken thing. But he only nodded, the pain and the truth of her words too much to bear. He will go for the water, Mateo said, his voice thick. Vane, he will not wait for the law. Eliza wiped her eyes, her face streaked with soot and tears. She looked at her hands, stained with his blood. I know. I have to stop him, he said, trying to push himself up. No, she said, her voice firm, her hands on his chest, pushing him gently back into the chair. You will not. You will heal. We will stop him, Tawa and I, and the town. He looked at her, at the small, fierce teacher, covered in ash and blood, and he saw the woman who had faced down gunmen with a blackboard. He saw the woman who had rung a bell in the middle of a fire. 7 days, he said, a grim promise. 7 days, she agreed, The plan was born in the smoky, quiet saloon, in the smell of spilled whiskey and Mateo's blood. It was a plan of desperation, a two-headed snake. "He will not wait 7 days," Mateo said again, his voice a strained whisper against the tight bandage. Eliza had gotten him to his small adobe house in town, but he refused to lie down. He sat at his table, the map and the ledger spread before him. "The lawyer was clear," Eliza said, her voice grim. She was pacing the small room. "He will take the spring by force. The injunction is just paper." Taza Naiche stood by the window, a silent shadow, his own wound bound. "He is right. Paper is weak, but paper is also his weapon. The map," he touched the buckskin, "is the truth, but the white man needs his own paper." "The original treaty," Eliza said, understanding. "It exists," Taza said. "One copy, at the old San Esteban mission. The one the soldiers burned. The priests. They hid their books. My grandfather told me." "That is 3 days' ride," Mateo said. He tried to shift in his chair, and a wave of pain and dizziness washed over him. "You are not going anywhere," Eliza said, her voice sharp with a fear she had not shown him before. "He will go to Ojo Verde tonight," Mateo rasped, ignoring her. "He will dynamite the spring. He will break it, just as Taza said. If he destroys the source, the treaty is worthless. The hearing is over before it begins." "Then we will go," Taza said, looking at Eliza. "No," Mateo said, pushing himself to his feet, his hand on the table for balance. His face was the color of ash. "It is my land, my water. I will be there." "You cannot even stand," Eliza pleaded. "Then I will be tied to my saddle," he said, his eyes burning with a cold fire that frightened her. "I know the dry sand routes. I can get us there without them hearing us. Taza, you will lead. Eliza," he looked at her, "you will carry the evidence. Milo and Jedediah are gathering the men who will stand. We ride in 1 hour." There was no arguing. This was the man of iron, and he was not rusted. He was forged. The night ride was a silent, moonless purgatory. Taza Naiche rode in the lead, his pony seeming to glide over the dark rocks of the Mesa de Luna, a place the townsfolk avoided, a place of ghosts. Behind him, a small, grim procession followed. Mateo was tied to his saddle, his body rigid with pain, his bullwhip coiled and hanging from his pommel. Eliza rode beside him, a heavy valise full of the ledgers and the map strapped to her own saddle. Behind them came Milo, the blacksmith, and Jedediah, all three heavily armed. They followed the ridges, staying off the main trail. Taza led them down a dry arroyo, the horses' hooves making almost no sound on the deep, loose sand. Mateo, despite the agony, directed them with grunted commands, guiding their path. They smelled the smoke before they saw the lights. Ojo Verde was not a large spring. It was a pool of clear, deep water, fringed with cottonwoods, that emerged from a cleft in the rock face. It was the life of the high desert, and Silas Vane was killing it. They topped the last rise and saw them, perhaps 10 of Vane's men. They were not bothering with stealth. They worked under the glare of 3 large lanterns, their voices loud and mocking. They were pounding fence posts directly into the soft earth at the water's edge. A low, ugly fence was already half built, near the cleft in the rock. 2 men were working with a heavy crate. Eliza saw the red sticks of dynamite. Silas Vane himself stood by the fire, a new pistol holstered at his hip, a cup of coffee in his hand. Marshal Cobb was with him, no longer a lawman, just a hired gun in a dirty vest, directing the work. "Crow!" Vane called out. He had seen them. The moonlight, breaking through the clouds, had glinted off Eliza's borrowed rifle. "I am surprised you can sit a horse. I see you brought the schoolmistress to watch." Vane Mateo's voice was a roar of pure fury, startling Eliza with its strength. "You are in violation of a federal injunction." Vane laughed, a rich, hearty sound that echoed off the rocks. An injunction Judge Monroe is a day's ride from here. Crow. By the time he gets back, this will be nothing but a muddy hole. This spring is closed. My railroad needs the right-of-way. Now, take your teacher and your Apache and ride out. This is business." "Eliza," Mateo grunted, his voice dropping, his hand gripping his saddle horn. "Now." Eliza's heart hammered. This was her part. She had argued for it, planned it with the children in the chaos after the trial. She slid from her horse, grabbing the lantern from her pack. She moved 50 yards along the ridge to a clear, flat rock. She fumbled with a match, her hands shaking, and lit the wick. She held up the lantern. Beside it, she held up a small hand mirror she had taken from her room. She angled it, catching the light, and flashed it 3 times toward a dark, low butte a half-mile to the north. Flash! 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 Vane saw it. "What is this, Signals?" He laughed. "Are you calling the army, Miss Hart?" "No, Mr. Vane," Eliza said, her voice carrying in the cold. "Clear air. I am calling my students." A new sound came from the north, a low, rolling noise. It was not thunder. It was hoofbeats, and with it, the high, thin bawling of calves. "What in God's name?" Cobb stammered, turning. From the darkness of the butte, a wave of motion appeared. It was the blacksmith's son, and young Tom, and Ben, Jedediah's boy. They were on ponies, whooping and yelling, driving a small herd of about 30 yearling calves straight toward the spring. The calves, smelling the water and frightened by the shouting, stampeded. It was a brilliant, foolish, childish plan. It was Eliza's plan. A stampede, not of heavy steers that would kill, but of frightened, chaotic calves that would simply disrupt. "Stop them!" Vane shrieked. His men turned, raising their rifles. "No!" Mateo yelled. "Fire on those children, and I will kill you all." The gunmen hesitated, and in that moment, the calves hit the camp. They were a wave of confused, bawling bodies. They smashed through the new fence, splintering the posts. They overran the campfire, sending sparks and coffee flying. They knocked over the lanterns. The entire camp was plunged into a chaos of shadows, shouting, and the panicked cries of animals. Vane's men were scattered, trying to protect themselves, their lines broken. In the confusion, one man did not panic. The dynamiter. He had been protected by the rock cleft. He saw his chance. He grabbed a single stick of dynamite, lit the fuse from a shielded ember, and ran toward the mouth of the spring. "Mateo!" Eliza screamed. Seeing him, Mateo had been waiting. This was his one, single shot. He spurred his dun horse, the animal leaping from the shadow of the ridge. The pain in his shoulder was a white, blinding fire. But he did not feel it. He was focused only on the burning fuse. He did not draw his rifle. He uncoiled his bullwhip. He rode straight across the spring's bank, a dark centaur in the chaos. He was 20 feet away when his arm flashed back, and then forward. The long, leather braid hissed through the air, a sound like a striking rattlesnake. It was a sound Vane's man heard a second too late. The whip cracked, a sound like a rifle shot, and the leather popper wrapped itself around the man's wrist. He screamed as the whip tore flesh. The stick of dynamite, its fuse sputtering, flew from his hand, tumbling end over end into the darkness. At the same instant, from the rocks above, Taza Naiche's rifle spoke. A single, sharp crack. He had not fired at a man. He had fired at the dynamite. The bullet struck the percussion cap. There was a dull pop. The fuse went out. The stick, neutralized, landed harmlessly in the mud. The stampede was already passing. The calves scattering into the hills. The silence that fell was heavier than before, broken only by the groans of Vane's men and the panting of Mateo's horse. Silas Vane stood in the ruins of his camp. His face, in the one remaining lantern light, was a mask of disbelief and pure, murderous rage. His plan, his railroad, his future, all of it, undone. By a woman, a broken rancher, an Apache, and a herd of children. He saw Eliza. She was standing on the rise, her lantern at her feet, watching him. He raised his pistol. He did not aim at Mateo, who was slumped in his saddle, barely upright. He did not aim at Taza, who was a ghost in the rocks. He aimed it with two steady hands, straight at Eliza's heart. "You," he whispered, the word of venomous breath. "This is all you." Eliza did not move. She did not flinch. She stood, her hands at her sides, and looked at the man who had tried to burn her world. "The children are watching Mr. Vane," she said, her voice not loud, but it cut through the night. "Ben, Tom, May, they are all watching." Vane's hand twitched. "They will write about you," Eliza continued, her voice gaining a strange, prophetic strength. "In their books, the books we will buy to replace the ones you burned. They will learn your name. They will write it down. Is this how you want to be remembered, as the man who declared war on a schoolhouse, as the man who shot a woman in the dark?" His finger tightened on the trigger. He was a man of power. He was a man who built things. He would not be stopped by words. But his hand was shaking. He saw the children, watching from the butte. He saw Jedediah and the blacksmith, their rifles now trained on him. He saw the faces of the entire town, peeking over the ridge. They had followed the militia. They had come to see the end. "Put the gun down, Vane!" The voice was cold, hard, and final. Judge Monroe stepped out of the darkness, his two armed officers beside him. The town militia, led by Milo, fanned out, their rifles ready. They had been drawn by the noise, guided by the very lantern Eliza had used to signal the children. "You are in violation of a federal injunction, sir," the judge said, as if commenting on the weather. "You are under arrest for that, for conspiracy, and for attempted murder. This time," he added, as his men seized a stunned and silent Vane, "there will be no bail." They cuffed Cobb, who was trying to pretend he was a victim. The fight was over. Eliza let out the breath she had been holding since she left town. She ran, not to Mateo, but to Taza, who was walking down from the rocks. She did not know what to say. She just threw her arms around him, a spontaneous, shocking gesture. He went stiff, unused to the touch, but he did not pull away. Eliza stepped back, her face flushed, and in a gesture of pure, unthinking respect. She bowed her head to him, a slight, deep dip of her chin. Taza looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the hint of a smile in his dark eyes. He nodded, once. Then she heard a sound, a slumping of leather. She spun around. Mateo had fallen from his horse. He was on the ground, his eyes closed, his face a deathly white. The ride, the whip, the agony. It had been too much. The bandage on his shoulder was a solid, dark mass of black blood. "Mateo!" she screamed, running to him, falling to her knees in the mud. "No, no, please!" She grabbed his good hand. It was cold. His eyes flickered open. He saw her, her face streaked with soot and tears, desperate. Above him, his eyes, full of pain, spoke to her. They said everything. They said, "We did it." They said, "I knew you could." They said, "Eliza." Then his eyes closed. The blacksmith walked to the edge of the spring, where the cottonwood branches dipped toward the water. He pulled something from his saddlebag. It was the small, brass bell from the schoolhouse, cracked, muddy, and silent. He hung it, gently, from a low branch. The clear, living water of Ojo Verde flowed past, silent and deep, reflecting the broken bell and the pale, still face of the man who had saved it. He did not die at Ojo Verde. The blacksmith and Jedediah made a litter from fence posts and a horse blanket, and they carried him back to town, a grim, silent procession that followed the judge's armed escort. Vane and Cobb, in irons, were hauled back, their face masks of stunned disbelief. Eliza walked beside the litter, her hand resting on Mateo's, willing the cold to leave him. She did not cry. Her fear was too cold, too deep for tears. Taza Naichi rode beside her, his own wound a dark, untreated line on his arm, his face a mask. They brought Mateo to his small adobe house in town, the man who had been the town doctor years ago, before he lost his nerve to the bottle, was sobered by the sight. He worked for an hour, his hands shaking, but his old skill returning. He stitched the wound, cleaned it, and bound it tight. The knife was dirty, he told Eliza, his voice rough. And the old wound? It was a bad one. He has a fever. The next 2 days, the fever will decide. Eliza did not leave. She sat in a wooden chair by his bed for 2 days and 2 nights. The town, in a state of shock, moved around her. Judge Monroe, having dispatched Vane and Cobb with his armed escort to the jail in Santa Fe, began his work. He posted a formal, ironclad injunction at the well, at the mine, and at the Ojo Verde Spring, declaring it protected by the authority of the United States Territorial Court. He formally indicted Frank and the other Vane gunmen and set a trial date. He interviewed every citizen, his questions sharp, his gaze missing nothing. And in that small, dark room, Eliza fought a different battle. She bathed Mateo's face with cool water from the well. She forced broth between his cracked lips. She listened to him murmur in his fever, words of old fights, of deserts, of men he had known. She heard him say her name, a low, broken question in the dark. "I am here, Mateo," she whispered, her hand on his, her voice a lifeline. "I am here." On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear, and saw her. She was asleep in the chair, her face pale, her hair a wild tangle, her hands stained with his dried blood. He saw the woman who had faced down fire, and he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than his wound, that he loved her. He did not speak. He just watched her until she woke, her eyes fluttering open, and saw him watching. A slow, relieved smile, the first she had ever truly given him, lit her face. "You are back, Mr. Crow." "You are still here, Miss Hart," he whispered. While Mateo healed, the town began to, as well. The shadow of Silas Vane was gone, and in its absence, the people of San Amaro looked at each other as if for the first time. They had seen what they were capable of, both the good and the bad. It started with Jedediah. He appeared at the blackened skeleton of the school, his hammer in his hand. He found the blacksmith already there, sifting through the charred wood. "She still stands," the blacksmith said, his voice gruff. "My boy, Ben," Jedediah said, his voice thick. He asked me if I would help, after what he did, with the calves." "Then let us not disappoint him," the blacksmith said. They began to work. They did not just repair. They rebuilt. They tore down the burned sections. Milo, now foreman of the Crow Mesa Ranch, brought in a wagon of new, straight pine, paid for by Mateo's account at the Mercantile. The sound of hammering once again filled the plaza, but this time, it was not one man. It was 5, then 10. Mrs. Paloma organized the women, bringing a constant supply of food and coffee. Even the men who had argued for Vane in the saloon came. Sheepishly, their hammers in their hand, they built the walls stronger. They built the roof higher than before. The legal victory came on a rider from Santa Fe. Judge Monroe had been true to his word. Silas Vane and Marshall Cobb were charged with conspiracy, arson, and attempted murder. The federal court, investigating the treaty, had validated Taza's map. The railroad, facing a scandal, issued a public statement that they had severed all ties with Vane and were indefinitely postponing the San Amaro route. The social healing was slower, but it was real. Jedediah and 2 other small ranchers, The ones who had wanted Taza's people excluded, walked across the plaza. Taza was sitting on the bench where he had always sat, watching the school being rebuilt. Jedediah stood in front of him, twisting his hat. Mr. Nietzsche, he said, the use of the formal name was an apology in itself. We were wrong. We were afraid. And you saved our town. You saved the children. He held out his hand. Taza looked at the hand. He looked at the man's face, at the genuine, painful shame in his eyes. He stood, and he took Jedediah's hand. He did not smile, but he nodded. A new order was posted at the well. A shared rotation for water, signed by Jedediah, the blacksmith, and Taza Nietzsche. A safe market day was declared for the first time, a day when anyone could trade in the plaza under a flag of truce. The school was finished. It was a solid, strong, unpainted building, its tin roof shining in the sun. The blacksmith had straightened the cracked, muddy bell and hung it in the new, solid doorway. Its voice was different now. It was no longer a high, clear ting. It was a lower, stronger thunk, a sound that had been through the fire and survived. They held a celebration. The whole town came. They brought pies, stews, and cornbread. Mateo was there, his left arm in a black sling, his face still pale, but his eyes clear. He stood beside Eliza as the children, all 9 of them, stood on the new school steps. They presented their gift. It was a long, smooth plank of pine, carved into it by young Tom's father, who had a gift for such things, were 3 lines of text. All are welcome to learn, todos son bienvenidos a aprender. The last line was in the angled, symbolic marks of the Chiricahua language. Taza Nietzsche was invited to speak. He stood before the town, no longer a silent outcast, but a founder. My people, he said, his voice quiet but carrying. Speak of the 3 fires. The first fire is small. It is the fire of the family. In the home, it keeps you warm. He looked at the families gathered, at Eliza and Mateo. The second fire is the community fire. It is large. All people come to it, to share meat, to share stories, to be one people. He gestured to the plaza, to the men and women, Anglo, Tejano, and his own people, standing together. But the third fire, he said, and he turned and placed his hand on the new wood of the schoolhouse, is the fire of knowledge. It is the fire you carry inside. It does not burn wood. It burns words. It burns truth. It is the fire that keeps the spirit alive when the world is dark and cold. You have built a house for this fire. You must keep it burning. He stepped back, and the town, in a sound that would have been impossible 1 month before, applauded. Later, when the sun was setting and the children were playing a game of tag in the plaza, Eliza and Mateo found themselves alone, standing behind the school, looking out at the desert. The noise of the celebration was a happy, distant sound. He reached out with his good hand and took hers. His hand was warm, the skin rough, his grip gentle. It is a good building, he said, his voice quiet. They made the roof higher, she said, her voice thick, just like I said. You did this, Eliza. You spoke it into being. She turned, her hand still in his, and leaned her head against his good shoulder. He was solid. He was real. No, she whispered. We did, Taza. You, the children. Even Jedediah. She smiled. This is what I was writing about in my letters home. I just did not know it. She looked up at him. Feels safe. He looked down at her, at the soot that was still under her nails, at the strength in her eyes. Home, he said, the word, a simple statement of fact. He looked at the schoolhouse, at the bell. Home can start with a bell, even a cracked one. I think, she said, her voice soft, it can start with a kiss, even one in the rain. He smiled, a slow, real smile that reached his dark eyes. And he leaned in, and he kissed her. A quiet promise of suppers, and shared work, and a life to be built. A week later, Taza found his new path. A man from the territorial capital, a scholar with a dusty coat, had sought him out. He was in charge of a new program, a traveling library. "I need a guide," the scholar said. "A man who knows the land, who speaks the languages, and who is not afraid of a hard ride. They say you are that man. We are carrying books, Mr. Naichi, to the mining camps, to the remote ranches, to the Apache villages. Will you guide us?" Taza looked at the school, at the children inside, their voices a low murmur as they read. He was a warrior. He would always be a warrior. But he knew the battlefield had changed. He nodded at the scholar. "I will guide you." That evening, as the sun set, Eliza was alone in the finished schoolhouse. The new pine smelled clean. The room was full of promise. She looked up at the new, high-roof beams. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the one thing she had saved from the very first day, the ruined, muddy quill pen she had jammed into the hard earth. She took the blacksmith's hammer from the toolbox, and she climbed the ladder. She stood on the top rung, reaching for the central rafter, the one that held the roof. She found a small, dark knot in the wood. She placed the sharp, broken tip of the quill against the wood, and with firm, steady blows, she hammered the pen into the beam. The feathers bent. The shaft protested, but it held. It became a nail, a peg, a part of the structure itself, a promise hammered into the very heart of the building, where it would hold the roof up, safe against the wind. The rainy season returned. It was not the single violent deluge that had saved the school, but a long, slow, soaking rain that settled the dust for the first time in a year. The high desert, which Eliza had only known as red and brown, began to show a faint, impossible haze of green. The air was clean, and it smelled of wet earth and piñon. Inside the new, strong walls of the San Amaro schoolhouse, the sound of the rain on the tin roof was a gentle drum. It was a sound of safety. The children, now numbering 12, no longer sat on the ground. They sat at the new pine benches, the ones Vane had gifted the church, which the town had promptly sanded down and moved into the school. The children were reading. Their voices rose in a ragged but determined chorus, reading from a new primer that had arrived from Santa Fe. Young Ben read, his voice clear. Taza's cousins read, their pronunciation precise and careful, and young Tom read, his voice the strongest of all. The school was a house of words, and it was warm. Taza Naichi had left 3 weeks earlier. He did not leave in the night. He left at dawn, as he had always intended. Eliza had met him in the plaza, the scholar with the spectacles waiting patiently with a string of pack ponies loaded with books. Taza was no longer just a warrior. He was a guide. He looked at the school, at the new, strong doorframe. The blacksmith had rehung the bell, the crack in its brass side a dark, jagged line. "It is a good house," Taza said. "Will you come back?" Eliza asked, her voice quiet. He did not answer directly. He reached into his parfleche bag and pulled out a small, tightly woven charm. It was made of yucca fiber, dyed red and black. It was simple, and it was beautiful. "This is strong," he said, pressing it into her hand. "The fiber holds." He looked up at the bell. "When the bell is silent," he said, "listen to the wind in this. The earth still speaks. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." Eliza closed her hand around the charm. "Thank you, Taza Naichi, for everything." He nodded, a deep, slow gesture of respect. He looked past her, toward the small adobe where Mateo was still healing. "The Iron Man," Taza said, a flicker of a smile in his eyes. "He is not iron. He is strung wood. He bends, but he does not break." He swung onto his pony. He did not look back. He rode out, not toward the hills, but east on the main road, leading the bookman into the wider world. The legal world. It turned out, moved slower than a freight wagon, but it did move. The official letter arrived on the same stagecoach that brought the new glass for the school windows. It was from Judge Monroe. Eliza read it aloud on the school steps. The whole town gathered to listen. The territorial government had formally recognized the Ojo Verde Treaty, placing the spring under permanent federal protection. Silas Vane and Marshall Cobb had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in the federal prison at Yuma. The Vane Mining Company had collapsed, its assets seized. A cheer went up from the crowd. Jedediah clapped the blacksmith on the back. Mrs. Paloma was openly weeping with relief. But the letter was not finished. Eliza read the last paragraph, her voice quieter. Mr. Vane's claims and the railroad's local interests, she read, have been purchased by a new consortium, a group of investors from Denver. They have expressed a formal interest in resuming development in the San Amaro region. The cheering stopped. The old, familiar fear crept back into the air. More, Jedediah spat. Just more of them. Let them come, a voice said. It was Mateo Crow. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, his arm no longer in a sling, his face pale but set. He walked forward to stand beside Eliza on the steps. Let them come, he said again, his voice clear and strong, reaching every person. They will not find a broken town. They will not find us afraid and fighting each other. They will find us here, together. They will find the law. He nodded to the letter. And they will find us. He looked at the crowd. And they will find a school. The fear in the plaza did not vanish, but it receded. It was replaced by a quiet, stubborn resolve. They were not the same people Vane had tried to break. They had been forged in the fire, just like the bell. That evening, the plaza was quiet. The rain had stopped. A silver mist was rising from the wet ground, and the air was soft. Eliza had finished for the day. She was sweeping the new pine floor, the scent of wood shavings and chalk in the air. She heard his step on the porch. Mateo. He was not wearing his town clothes. He was in his rancher's gear, his heavy coat, his bullwhip coiled at his side. His dun horse was tied to the rail, packed for a long ride. Eliza's heart gave a single, painful jolt. You are leaving. I am going home, he said, his voice quiet. He stood in the doorway, the setting sun at his back. To the ranch, to Ojo Verde. He paused. The town adobe is fine, but it is not home. He stepped inside. He was not looking at her, but at the room, at the children's slates, at the carved board above the blackboard. It is a 2-hour ride. Eliza, even fast. It is too long to be away from the ranch. And he finally met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. Too long to be away from you. He reached into his pocket. He was not carrying a velvet box. He was carrying a single, heavy, black iron key. The ranch house is big, he said, his voice soft. It is empty. It has been empty for a long time. It needs life. He held the key out to her. It was not a question of passion. It was a question of partnership. It was a question of building. If you want, he said, his voice husky, we can hang another bell there. Eliza looked at the key in his hand. It was a key to a house. It was a key to a spring. It was a key to the man. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She put her hand out and took it from him. The iron was heavy, and it was warm. I came to San Amaro to build a school, she whispered, her voice thick with tears she would not shed. She looked up, from the key to his face. And I stayed to build us. He moved, his good arm coming around her, pulling her close. His embrace was not the desperate, saving warmth of the rainstorm. It was not the pained grip of the saloon. It was an embrace of equals. It was an embrace of partners. It was solid, and it was sure. He bent his head, and his kiss was a promise, a foundation, a roof against the storm. It was respectful, it was profound, it was home. The next day, as the afternoon lessons ended, Eliza stood in the doorway of the school. The children poured out into the plaza, their shouts and laughter the new, true sound of the town. She reached for the bell rope. She pulled. The sound of the bell, that cracked, imperfect thunk, rolled across the plaza. It was a stubborn, strong, beautiful sound. It was the sound of survival. The sound traveled. It rolled over the new green hills. It crossed the dry arroyos, now running with clear water. It reached the high mesa, and it found the cottonwood trees at Ojo Verde, where a small, woven yucca charm twisted in the evening breeze. Mateo came and stood beside her in the doorway. He did not speak. He just placed his hand over hers, his fingers covering her own, his warmth sinking into her skin as they held the rope together. She thought of the theme she had written in her journal all those weeks ago. Freedom, she thought, was not just a word in a book. It was a thing that could only survive if it stood beside knowledge, and justice, and a courage that was willing to face the fire. The sun was setting, and the silver mist began to rise from the damp earth, wrapping the small town in a soft, luminous light. The schoolhouse, strong and new, seemed to rise with it, like a ship setting sail on a silver sea. Eliza Hart, who had come to teach children their letters, looked at the man beside her, his hand covering hers. The Old West, she knew, was not just a land of dust and fast guns. It was a land of hard ground, waiting for someone stubborn enough to build a classroom on it, a place that was learning, slowly, how to love the truth. Thank you for listening to this story. Comment below where you are listening from. Subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people.